The word terrified is precise. Not surprised, not impressed, not humbled, though humility always follows. Terrified. Because there is a specific sensation that moves through researchers, archaeologists, and traditional custodians alike when a burial site is opened and what is found inside does not match anything the known record prepared them for. It is the terror of suddenly understanding that everything you thought you knew about this continent, about these people, about the depth and complexity of what was here before, was not wrong exactly, but so radically incomplete that the gap between what you believed and what the evidence is now telling you feels like the ground shifting under your feet. Australia has produced that sensation repeatedly. In cave systems, and sand dunes, and riverbanks, and cliff faces across the continent, ancient burial sites have yielded discoveries so unexpected, so old, so scientifically and culturally significant, that the researchers who opened them spent years afterward working through the implications. Some of those implications rewrote textbooks. Some of them are still being argued in peer-reviewed journals. And some of them carry a weight that goes beyond science entirely, into questions about identity and sovereignty and the ownership of the deep past that no amount of radiocarbon dating can resolve by itself. Every site on this list is real. Every discovery described here is documented. The terror is real too. It just does not come from curses. It comes from truth. Number 10. Cow Swamp and the faces that should not have existed. In 1967, on the floodplain of the Murray River in northern Victoria, a farmer named Alan Thorne was plowing a paddock near the town of Kohuna when his equipment struck something. What followed was the beginning of one of the most scientifically significant and ethically complicated archaeological episodes in Australian history. The site, which became known as Cow Swamp, turned out to contain one of the largest collections of ancient human skeletal remains ever found in Australia, with eventually more than 40 individuals recovered from burials spread across an area of the dry lake bed, dated to between approximately 9,000 and 13,000 years ago. The terror came from the faces. The skulls recovered from Cow Swamp were morphologically unlike anything researchers expected to find in anatomically modern humans of that age. They were robust to a degree that bordered on archaic, with pronounced brow ridges, receding foreheads, thick cranial bone, and facial projections that looked, to the researchers who first analyzed them, more like features associated with much older hominin species than with modern humans. Alan Thorne, then at the Australian National University, and Philip Reitmeyer, published analyses suggesting these skulls represented a genuinely distinct morphological population within ancient Australia, one that he argued might trace its ancestry to Homo erectus populations in Asia, rather than to the fully modern humans arriving from Africa. The implication that Australia had been occupied by multiple morphologically distinct human lineages was scientifically explosive. The debate it ignited between Thorne's multi-regional evolution hypothesis and the competing out-of-Africa model became one of the central controversies in paleoanthropology for decades. Later analysis, including ancient DNA work, has not supported the multi-regional interpretation, and the current consensus favors explanations involving artificial cranial deformation, a practice of deliberately reshaping the skull by binding during infancy that is documented in many ancient cultures worldwide as the more likely explanation for the Cow Swamp morphology. But the terror of that initial encounter, the moment when researchers looked at these faces and realized they could not explain them within any existing framework, was entirely real. And the additional terror came later, when the Yorta Yorta people, whose country Cow Swamp lies within, demanded the return of the remains for reburial, initiating a legal and ethical battle over the ownership of ancient human remains that reverberated through institutions across Australia and ultimately changed the laws governing how archaeological material is handled in this country. Number 9. The Lake Nietzsche burial and the man with the necklace. In 1969, 2 years after the Cow Swamp discoveries began, a drought dropped the water level of Lake Nietzsche in western New South Wales low enough to expose a burial that had been lying beneath the lakebed sediments since approximately 6,820 years ago. The individual recovered was a male of substantial physical stature, estimated at approximately 184 centimeters in height, which made him unusually tall for any ancient population but particularly striking in the context of prehistoric Australian skeletal material. What terrified the researchers was not his size, it was what was around his neck. The burial contained a necklace of 178 Tasmanian devil teeth, each one carefully perforated and strung in a sequence that represented not only significant craft skill, but a collection of teeth from a minimum of 47 individual Tasmanian devils. Tasmanian devils were already extinct on the mainland at the time of this burial. Their disappearance from the continent attributed to competition with dingoes and potentially human hunting pressure, meaning that this necklace represented either a collection accumulated over a very long period or evidence of a trade network connecting the mainland to Tasmania at a time when Bass Strait had already separated the two landmasses. The research team led by M.B. Tyndale and colleagues who analyzed the Lake Nietzsche burial were confronted with evidence of a social complexity, a symbolic culture, and a trade infrastructure that the prevailing understanding of prehistoric Australian societies had not prepared them for. A man buried with a necklace representing the teeth of 47 individual animals of an already rare or locally extinct species, arranged in a sequence suggesting deliberate aesthetic composition, is not a member of a simple society. He is a member of a society with surplus capacity, with long-distance trade connections, with craft traditions requiring significant time investment, and with mortuary practices sophisticated enough to send an individual into death adorned with the most impressive collection of symbolic material that his community could assemble. The Lake Nietzsche man is now held in the collections of the Australian Museum, and his burial remains one of the most vivid single windows into the social complexity of prehistoric Australia that the archaeological record has produced. Number 8. The Devil's Lair, Human Bone, and the Ritual that Predated Everything. Devil's Lair Cave in southwestern Western Australia has appeared in previous discussions of Australian prehistory for its extraordinary depth of occupation, stretching back approximately 48,000 years. But what opens a specific dimension of terror in its record is a particular category of find from the cave's deeper layers. Human bone fragments, processed in ways that suggest deliberate, ritualized treatment of the dead at ages that push against the limits of what the archaeological community had been willing to attribute to Pleistocene Australians. Among the materials recovered from Devil's Lair by Charles Dortch and colleagues from the Western Australian Museum were bone fragments bearing cut marks and traces of burning at stratigraphic levels dated to between 12,000 and 15,000 years ago. The cut marks on human bone are significant because they indicate deliberate defleshing, the removal of soft tissue from bone using stone tools, a practice associated in ethnographic contexts worldwide with secondary burial traditions, with ancestral bone curation, and in some cases, with ritual consumption of the dead as an act of cultural incorporation rather than nutritional desperation. The terror this produced in the research community was not about horror in the popular sense. It was about the implications of finding evidence of such a specific and culturally sophisticated mortuary practice at that age in southwestern Australia, at a time when the prevailing narrative held that complex ritual behavior in this region was considerably more recent. What the Devil's Lair evidence suggested, and what subsequent research at other sites has progressively confirmed, is that the ritual treatment of human remains in Australia, with all the social infrastructure of belief and obligation and ceremony that such treatment requires, extends back into the deep Pleistocene, tens of thousands of years further than anyone had been prepared to acknowledge. Number 7. The Runka Flat Cemetery and the War It Almost Started. On the banks of the Murray River in South Australia, a site called Runka Flat contains a cemetery that was in use intermittently from approximately 18,000 years ago through two relatively recent Aboriginal historical times, making it one of the longest used burial grounds in the world, and one of the most important archaeological sites on the continent. The excavations at Runka, conducted primarily by Philip Clark and colleagues from the South Australian Museum beginning in the early 1970s, recovered burials spanning this entire time frame, with the oldest individuals dated to the late Pleistocene, and the youngest to the period of European contact. What terrified the researchers who opened the oldest burials was the evidence of trauma. The skeletal remains from certain periods within the Runka sequence show patterns of injury, healed fractures, unhealed wounds, consistent with violent assault, and in some cases, evidence of causes of death that point unambiguously toward interpersonal violence. These findings landed in the middle of an already fraught academic debate about the nature of prehistoric Australian societies, a debate with political as well as scientific dimensions, because the question of whether Aboriginal Australians engaged in organized violence before European contact had been weaponized by various ideological agendas on multiple sides. The researchers were terrified, not just by what they found, but by what publishing it would mean in a political environment where archaeological evidence was regularly conscripted into arguments about land rights, sovereignty, and the character of indigenous societies. What the evidence actually shows, examined carefully and without political agenda, is consistent with what anthropological research worldwide has established about human societies generally. That violence has always been part of the human behavioral repertoire. That prehistoric societies were neither the peaceful utopias of one ideological fantasy, nor the chaos of another. And that the Runka people, across 18,000 years of burial practice, were a complex, changing society whose relationship to violence and peace was as nuanced as that of any human community in any time or place. Number 6. The Nakri burial and the skull that moved between worlds. Among the skeletal material recovered from sites in the Murray River region and subsequently analyzed in the context of the broader debate about morphological diversity in ancient Australians, the Nakri individual occupies a specific and unsettling position. Found in riverine deposits in Victoria and analyzed by researchers including Peter Brown at the University of New England, the Nakri skull presents a combination of features that place it morphologically between the gracile, fully modern individuals from sites like Lake Mungo and the robust individuals from Cow Swamp. A transitional morphology in a region and time period where the two populations may have been in contact, in conflict, or in the process of merging. What terrified the researchers who examined Nakri was the implication that the ancient human population of southeastern Australia was not a single group, but a mosaic, a meeting place of morphologically distinct peoples whose interaction, over thousands of years, produced the biological diversity visible in the skeletal record. The terror was intellectual rather than visceral. The terror of a puzzle that keeps producing new pieces that do not fit the picture you thought you were assembling. Peter Brown's detailed morphometric analysis of the Nakri skull, published in the journal Archaeology in Oceania, remains one of the most careful attempts to navigate the minefield of ancient Australian morphological diversity. And its conclusions are honest about the limits of what bone shape alone can tell us about population history, genetic relationship, and the lived experience of people who died thousands of years before anyone thought to ask questions about them. Number 5. The Willandra Lakes fossil field and the child who changed everything. Among all the human remains recovered from the Willandra Lakes World Heritage Area in western New South Wales, one discovery holds a particular emotional and scientific weight that separates it from even the extraordinary finds that surround it. In the sediments of the ancient lakeshore, researchers working the site in the years following the initial Mungo discoveries found the burial of a child, an individual estimated to have been between 3 and 5 years of age at death, interred with a care and deliberateness that left no ambiguity about the community's relationship to the loss of someone so young. The burial included evidence of ochre, the same red pigment found on Mungo Man, placed on or near the child's body within the date of the burial, approximately 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, makes it one of the oldest known burials of a child anywhere in the world. What terrified the researchers was not what they found, but what it forced them to feel, which is the experience that professional distance is supposed to prevent, and that, in this case, proved impossible to maintain. The burial of a child with ochre and care, 15,000 years ago, on the shore of a lake that has not held water for most of that time, is not an abstraction. It is a grief that crosses every boundary of time and culture and training. Researchers who have worked this site and who have spoken publicly about the experience of encountering this burial have used language that sits outside the usual register of scientific publication. They have spoken about the weight of it, about the way it removed the comfortable intellectual distance that the phrase prehistoric human remains usually provides, and replaced it with something more direct and less manageable. The child buried at Willandra was someone's child. The people who placed the ochre were people whose grief was indistinguishable from grief as it exists today. And acknowledging that, fully and without retreat into technical language, is both the simplest and the most terrifying thing the Australian archaeological record asks of the people who study it. Number 4. The Kubul Creek bones and the collection that should never have existed. In the 1950s, a farmer ploughing land near the Kubul crossing on the Murray River in New South Wales turned up human skeletal material. Over time, more material was collected from the same general area, and eventually a collection of 126 individual skulls and associated bones, representing one of the largest single assemblages of prehistoric human remains ever found in Australia, made its way into institutional custody at the University of Melbourne. The Kubul Creek collection became one of the most scientifically significant and ethically problematic assemblages in Australian anthropology. Significant because its size allowed statistical analysis of morphological variation across a sample large enough to produce genuinely meaningful results. Problematic because the circumstances of its collection, in an era before any legal or ethical framework existed for the treatment of indigenous remains, meant that the material had been removed from country without consent, without community knowledge, and without any of the protocols that would later be established to govern such situations. When researchers, including Peter Brown, published analyses of the Kubul Creek collection in the 1980s, the findings added substantially to the morphological diversity picture already emerging from Cow Swamp and other sites, showing a population with cranial features clustering toward the robust end of the modern human spectrum and providing data points that fed directly into the multi-regional versus out of Africa debate that was consuming paleoanthropology at the time. The terror of Kubul Creek is distributed across multiple parties. For the researchers who first analyzed the material, it was the terror of data so anomalous that it resisted easy interpretation. For the Tati Tati and Wamba Wamba peoples, whose ancestors the collection represents, it was a different and far more fundamental terror. The terror of opening a drawer in a university building and finding your grandparents numbered and labeled and arranged as specimens, removed from country without permission, used without consultation, held without accountability. The repatriation of the Kubul Creek collection, eventually completed after years of negotiation, did not resolve the ethical questions the collection raised. It only moved them to a slightly less acute register. Number 3. The Pleistocene, cannibalism evidence, and what it demands of the living. At several sites across Australia, in deposits ranging from the late Pleistocene to the mid-Holocene, researchers have recovered human bone fragments, bearing marks that indicate deliberate processing by other humans. The evidence takes several forms: cut marks in characteristic positions, indicating defleshing; percussion fractures, consistent with marrow extraction; burning patterns on bone consistent with cooking, rather than with the incidental burning of a burial; long bones split in ways that match the processing of large mammal bones for marrow at the same sites. The research team, including Judith Field at the University of New South Wales and colleagues, examining skeletal material from multiple Murray River sites, has been careful and rigorous in its analysis of this evidence, precisely because the implications are significant and the potential for misrepresentation is enormous. The terror for researchers encountering this evidence operates on several levels simultaneously. There is the intellectual terror of a finding that complicates the narrative. There is the methodological terror of knowing that every alternative explanation must be exhausted before the most confronting interpretation is accepted. There is the political terror of publishing findings that will be misread, stripped of context, weaponized by people with agendas that have nothing to do with understanding the deep human past. And there is, underneath all of that, the simpler and more direct terror of standing in front of evidence that forces you to reckon with the full range of what human beings have done to each other, in every culture, in every period, on every continent, including this one. The evidence for mortuary cannibalism in prehistoric Australia does not make the people who practiced it monsters. It makes them human. And that is, in its own way, the most terrifying conclusion of all. Number 2. The Kutakina cave discoveries and the Ice Age survivors at the end of the world. In 1981, a survey team working in the rugged limestone karst country of southwest Tasmania, in what was then a remote and largely unexplored wilderness, pushed into a cave above the Franklin River and found themselves in a space that had been sealed by sediment for approximately 13,000 years. The cave, which came to be known as Kutakina, turned out to contain the southernmost known Pleistocene human occupation site in the world, a site where Aboriginal Tasmanians had sheltered during the last ice age, in conditions of extraordinary harshness, at a latitude equivalent to parts of Norway, in a landscape of glaciers and tundra. The research team, including Rhys Jones from the Australian National University and Don Ranson from the Tasmanian Department of Lands, found evidence of repeated occupation extending back to approximately 20,000 years ago, through the peak of the last glacial maximum, when this area was one of the coldest and most inhospitable environments on the planet, where humans were known to live. Among the materials recovered were bones of the animals these people had hunted, overwhelmingly dominated by Bennett's wallaby and wombat, processed with stone tools made from Darwin glass, a natural glass formed by a meteorite impact in the region approximately 800,000 years ago, that provided a uniquely sharp and workable raw material. The terror at Kutakina was multidimensional. For the researchers, it was the terror of discovering that human beings had survived in these conditions, in an ice age landscape at the bottom of the world, using technology refined specifically for that environment, and subsisting on prey hunted across frozen river valleys that are now deep temperate rainforests. For the broader public, when the discovery was announced, it arrived in the middle of one of Australia's most significant environmental battles. The campaign to prevent the damming of the Franklin River, and the evidence of Ice Age human occupation at Kutakina, became one of the most powerful arguments against the dam, demonstrating that what the government proposed to flood was not empty wilderness, but a place of extraordinary human historical significance. The Franklin was saved. And the terror of Kutakina, the terror of almost losing a 20,000-year record of human survival at the end of the world, became part of the argument for why ancient places are worth protecting, even when we do not yet know what they contain. Number 1. The Return of Mungo Man, and the Obligation That Cannot Be Buried. In 1974, Jim Bowler discovered the remains of a man who had been buried on the shore of a dried lake in outback New South Wales, approximately 42,000 years ago. The remains, which became known as Mungo Man, were removed to the Australian National University in Canberra, where they were studied, stored, debated, and held for more than 4 decades. In 1992, the traditional custodians of the Willandra Lakes region, the Muthi, Ingyampa, and Pakanchi peoples, formally requested the return of Mungo Man and the other remains from their country held in institutional collections. The request was not immediately granted. What followed was a 26-year process of negotiation, of legal complexity, of institutional reluctance, and of persistent, patient, unwavering advocacy by the custodian communities, during which Mungo Man became the most debated set of human remains in Australian history and one of the most debated in the world. The terror that Mungo Man produced in the scientific community was not the terror of the burial itself. Extraordinary as that discovery was, it was the terror of what returning him would mean. Mungo Man had been subjected to more scientific analysis than perhaps any other prehistoric individual in Australian history. His remains had produced genetic data, morphological data, isotopic data, information about diet and movement and physical development that contributed to multiple fields of research. Returning him to country, to be reburied in the ground from which he had come, meant accepting that the obligation to the living descendants of the dead takes precedence over the scientific value of studying them. That is not a comfortable conclusion for institutions built on the premise that knowledge, once obtained, must be preserved and made available. It requires a fundamental reorientation of values, a willingness to accept that some knowledge belongs to specific people in specific places, and that the right to determine what happens to ancestral remains is not the scientific community's to hold. In November 2017, Mungo Man was brought home. He traveled from Canberra to the Willandra Lakes in a convoy, accompanied by hundreds of Aboriginal people from the custodian communities. In a journey that took on the character of something between a funeral and a liberation, he was received on country with ceremony. He was held, briefly, by the elders whose ancestor he was, and then he was placed in secure, keeping on his own country, in the care of the people to whom he had always belonged. The terror of Mungo Man is the terror of every ancient burial on this list, finally named, clearly. It is the terror of recognizing that the dead do not belong to science. They belong to the living, who carry their memory. And in Australia, those living people, the custodians of the longest continuous human story on Earth, have been asking for that recognition for a very long time. The archaeological record of this continent is extraordinary. The people responsible for it are still here. Both of those truths deserve the same weight, and holding them together, without flinching from either, is the most important thing the study of ancient Australia can teach the rest of the world. Every burial on this list was opened by people who thought they knew what they would find. None of them did. That is the nature of this continent's deep past. It keeps exceeding the frameworks we build to contain it. And the most terrifying thing about it is not the age, or the morphology, or the evidence of violence or ritual. It is the moment when the gap between the living and the dead collapses, when the person in the ground stops being a specimen and becomes an ancestor, and the obligation that recognition carries falls on everyone in the room. If this reached something in you, something worth sharing, pass it on. These stories belong to all of us, but they belong to some of us more than others, and knowing the difference is where understanding begins.